Yeah, I know people will be rolling in, but so the three people we have lined up here, folks, for me, are very meaningful, and their interrelation, and what I'm have been in terms of my own sort of wisdom, mental health, ways of thinking. I'll start with Bruce. So Bruce Alderman. Dude, I experienced Bruce as one of the wisest people I know, and that shined through very early in our connection. His grammatology and vision for Mount Sophia, and just the way he has presenced himself across so many different contexts is just an aspiration and inspiration to me. And he has been a shoulder to lean on at times. He's been a philosophical guide. He's introduced me to TSK. I wish I knew more about it, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it today. That's super exciting for me. Baron, who I have not known as long, Andre Marquis introduced me to Baron, and Baron has been on an integral journey, been on a philosophical journey, been on a reflective journey, a fellow health service professional, a psychiatrist, a clinical psychologist. Sometimes those groups actually don't marry well together, but between us, it's a wonderful relation. And then as we talked, Baron's evolution of himself, or of his framework into the UTOK, into the UTIK formulation, that blog series, when we get that sort of like nailed to the right languaging and shared in the right way, I think that's an unbelievably super cool path. You know how excited I am in relationship to that, so we'll learn more about that. And then Rob Scott. Rob helped me name the system UTOK. Rob helped me set up the first website in relationship to it. And more than that, I met Rob coming off of 2019, which I had a bump with the program and my identity. And Rob's insights around fundamental identity shifting were transformative for me. They're just absolutely to this day. Actually, Mossy's got the clip. We have a little just read Rimit. That's it. UTOK's language of shifting to the fundamental identity shift from the way the ego and the experiential shift and the persona grab, and the dialectic between that. Almost every day, I would say, I encounter that and reflect on that. So, Rob, I'm deeply, deeply grateful for what our friendship, what the lights you've shown on my life in relation. So, thank you. Thank you. That's the first thing I want to say. Thank you to all three. And then the second thing, as you hear from that, is, UTOK's a lot of shit. UTOK's a big fucking system. And a lot of it, I've written about at the analytic level, but it is ultimately, I'm a clinician. Ultimately, I'm wondering about how we can be in the world. I see so much neurotic suffering in the world. And the data suggests that we're not going in the right direction at all. Yet there's so much opportunity to live in this world in a way that's fulfilling, and that's fundamentally what I see this session as, is like, how do we live in a world in a way that's fulfilling? I think these three presentations are going to be very, very rich in that regard. And so, without further ado, I'm blanking a little bit on the order, but I'll pause and then I'll turn it over. Did you guys have a decision about who would go first? I probably missed that email in the flood.
I think I was going to go first, but I'm open either way, whatever you guys prefer.
Yeah, I think we said Baron and then Bruce and then I'll go last. Yeah.
Beautiful. Great. Okay. All right, Baron, take us on the UTIK journey then.
All right. Let me share my screen. All right. Can you guys see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks again. I'm super stoked to be here for this talk, and I'm as excited to learn about TSK and more about the fundamental shift. And it'll be interesting in our conversation to see how those interrelate. My day job, I'm a medical director of the brain stimulation service at the Medical University of South Carolina. So for some people, I'd say I'm a brain electrician. For the UTOK audience, I could say I'm a Mind One firmware specialist, while not ignoring the rest of the mind and the beings that we are. I do a variety of non-invasive and invasive type of stimulation. Could be another thing we talk about at some point. I do have patients with like cortical stimulators in their brain, and they will ask me things like, am I a cyborg? And I go, we should talk about that. All right, let me move on here. So some disclosures. I am an unpaid consultant for a variety of TMS and ECT type devices, paid consultant also for vagus nerve stimulators, and I'm a co-founder of Zendo, which is a wearable headband that we use to enhance mindfulness. So we've got studies where we've done that. We've sold out version 1.
Distributions of.
I'm sorry?
Somebody wasn't muted. I'll make sure they are.
Okay. We have version 2 that will be coming out this summer. So that's pretty exciting. And I'll briefly mention that it does come up. Overview is a little bit about why did I make a UTIK, connect it to UTOK, and then we'll go through PTOK, personal theory of knower, UTIK, and with time kind of go through an example of multimodal mindful mindedness. That's a mouthful. So first, why UTIK? So perhaps this would be the most personal I've been in a public setting about some of these interiorities, but I think it's very important as we're looking at the problem of the psyche to actually talk and look at a psyche as a case example. And so pretty early, it was about 18, I went through my first existential crisis of what's the point of life? Why am I here? Is it to, go to school, get a job, get married, have kids, get divorced, and die? And I said, I think there's got to be a lot more to it, but I have no idea what that is, which put me on a pretty intensive journey, inner and outer. So including traveling around the planet on a ship, traveling across countries and different continents, a lot of inner journeys, all the way, psychedelics, Native American sweat lodges, Zen monasteries. If it was out there, I was going to try it to see what it could teach me. As part of that, there was a consequence. One of the consequences was a bit of ontological shock. And again, this kind of will go into, you'll see where this model goes and where these pieces fit, including a recognition of a basic sense of awareness. It's pretty early in of like feeling as if, not that I'm just located in this body, but as a field in which the body is located, in which the world is located. I had no neuroscientific framework like predictive processing about models. I didn't have a philosophical framework, and I didn't have a theological framework, which put folks familiar. There's a lot out there. I just had no clue. Also had an experience that I couldn't shake, of this experience of, in many ways, what I'm as a matter of experience, that this is a dream, and not having, again, a framework for that put me a bit into a postmodern madness, is what I call it now. And where I had this experiential plasticity, where I was shifting between worldviews with no sense of what was more true, if such a thing, or what was more tied to what's real, which then kind of put me back into a journey of more integrative visions in natural science, kind of complexity science, big picture, big history, and into the integral scene. And there for a while, I was kind of director of the integral psychiatry part of the Integral Institute. Just really doubled down into you don't have to know all of reality, but you can still be a source or a vehicle of help, and giving and receiving psychotherapy and learning about ego and persona. While I was reading a book in 2009, Thank God for Evolution by Michael Dowd, I had this just inversion where instead of feeling like a person in the world, I felt like the world in a person, that I at the time called cosmic embodiment. And I realized it would take at least 10 years probably to get a language to discuss that. As I talked very briefly about Zendo, this was a device that helped me really come in contact with basic sense of awareness and what I would call the roots of sensory experience. So being able to just slow down and have attention, look at thoughts, feelings, sensations, and really see the ticker, like slow it down and see the ticker clock and how that mind is constructing, which was a pretty pivotal thing. Then I discovered Greg through Dre, and just really got lit with UTOK and thought, man, this is a great, great framework. And let's look at this, what we call UTIK, where we're looking at the phenomenology, personal philosophy, and connecting it with UTOK. So first parts were just thinking about the PTOK, or personal theory of the knower, to say that every human being has metaphysical and empirical commitments. Everybody has a worldview with philosophical features. Everybody has an idiographic or unique way of experiencing themselves, others, in the world. And the aim would be to reflect on this implicit, subjective, metaphysical, empirical, or small me, and make it explicit, and ideally to connect it with a larger me, a larger metaphysical, empirical framework of UTOK. And for folks familiar with that language, it would include taking your iQuad coin and rotating it into a better examination, and then flipping the coin and connecting it to the tree of life, which I do have a little slide on. I'll talk about that shortly. First, thinking about some of these philosophical frameworks, the UTIK meta context has a zoomed out big picture way to frame. And my specific PTOK about this would include things like transcendent naturalism, which has been discussed during this conference. It has a specific psychospiritual set of practices to connect the self to the whole. So connecting yourself and knowing who you are and connecting to the whole. And so a lot of this, in a sense, that even this talk includes talking about riding, or talking about the practice, which is like talking about riding a bike, versus the actual embodied pathos of experiencing riding a bike is a very different thing. So I do put that out there. And that this is an inside-out, bottom-up approach where we're saying, let's do the inner work and actualize it within the individual, connect it socially, and to say, how do we play our role in the bottom-up approach? So we need top-down, in the middle, and bottom-up approaches. So this is the bottom-up approach of within the individual, of playing your part in repurposing, rebuilding your role in humanity to address the meta crisis at the fifth joint point. So as part of that, we need an epistemology of how we know what we know. And in this, talking about the psyche, talking about four main types of mindfulness, and that these are not, perhaps historically, sometimes they're a little separated, east and west, but we're in a place where we can put these things together in a coherency. So four types talk about attentional mindfulness, awareness mindfulness, psychological mindfulness, and transjective. So attentional would be much like what we hear about in Western forms of mindfulness, where we're learning to kind of re-embody and be present moment to moment without judgment. Can include kind of zeroing in on what we see, hear, and feel out in the world, but also our inner speech and inner imagination and mentation. Awareness practices we see much more in the East, but also in the West, would include kind of different windows or portals into understanding, without getting into the ontology of what's out in the world or real, but just that at a very base of our experience, we are this sense of awareness. There are different terms that people use, and so not to get caught up on the term, but there are various spatial practices, which include recognizing that you don't always just have to feel like you're coming from behind your eyes, or temporal practices where we look at things like memory and imagination as part of the construction of how we experience time or how we experience a past and a future through memory and imagination. And it's an interesting thing to actually notice when that arises in the mind. Self-inquiry techniques like who am I or who am I not? I'm not my thoughts. I'm not my feelings. Am I my ego? I have an ego, but am I my ego? And surrender practices, which have to do with letting go of a controller, letting go of having to know, letting go of having to change something, and to sit with that is transformative. Psychological mindfulness, I don't need to go into detail here, but Calm MO, I think that's a quintessential practice in a psychological mindfulness, and hopefully we'll hear more about that later with Dre and Greg's talk. And then transjective mindfulness, which maybe has some parallels with TSK, we'll see, but it's about the complexity of thinking, considering and contemplating deep time, space, complexity out in the world, like the TOK, tree of knowledge, but then also how that is reflected within us as minded animals. Recursion about the self tree, which I haven't introduced that yet, and then the dialectic between first and third person, this kind of transjective view of the personal, tree of knowledge and the knower within you. So, what are some potential positive side effects with a multimodal mindfulness? In my view of that, looking at the ontology of it. From the attentional practices, we can come in contact with our experiential self. When we're riding that bike, if you will, that includes a real sense of relaxed embodiment and easy-heartedness and a clear-mindedness that kind of precedes like heavy justification and thought. Awareness practices where we can actually not only come in contact, but actually understand that as a foundation of who we are as a matter of experience. And there tend to be some side effects of a deep sense of freedom or peace or love that comes from that. Psychological mindfulness, we get clarity in our ego and persona. We can cultivate healthy self-love and value and essentially rewrite some of our psychological defenses that occur within us and then between us in social interaction, which I think applies to that recursive relevance realization relationality in our talk just before. And then the transjective, where in a very basic sense, we really come to know, not just at an intellectual level, but a felt sense that we are a focal embodiment or feature of existence. We are enmattered, enlivened, enminded, and encultured, and we feel a deep impulse. We feel an alignment with the cosmos, and seeing ourselves as an expression of this whole process. That we wish to exist, evolve, and transform, that includes us, but is beyond this lifetime, and to actually then align with that which is greater than your personal self. So this is a representation, a visual representation of the tree and the knower. So this would be like a first-person ontology of the psyche. Here on the left, I have rings of a tree, essentially, if thinking about the tree trunk, if we're representing that as part of the self, and that there's this experiential self at the core with a ego and a public persona as layers from that. I would put out a speculation that there's also a transjective layer that can form, and perhaps as an unintended side effect from contemplating things like UTOK that could happen. But then within the trunk, there's also the roots. So the roots of our sensory experience, 4 doors of perception, what we see, hear, and feel out in the world, see, hear, and feel in. What those roots are, quote, experientially grounded in is the metaphorically the ground of awareness. Again, to think of this as a symbolic representation, it's not literal. But that within that field of experience, that we can come in contact with, we can notice the roots, we can reform. In many ways, if we're taking care of our tree within ourselves, we want to be grounded, rooted, have our tree trunk and rebuild it, reformat, expand it, and then reach out. So reach out personally, interpersonally, and extrapersonally. And one could get quite concrete with that. Here we're just, and specific, here we're just talking about representations, leaves, flowers, seeds, fruits. as leaves, essentially saying, what do you need for your own nourishment? Flowers, what have you expressed as a form of beauty and being? And seeds of things that of the potential for becoming that you will share out in the world, and the fruit of doing. I think somebody might need to mute, but
sorry, somebody needs to unmute. I'm trying to check and see who that is.
No worries. So from an axiological perspective, I kind of reframed the UTOK mantra, and just added a bit here and said, realize, actualize the unified tree in the knower by connecting to the tree of life and embodying your valuable place in the garden under God. And so if we took the iQuad coin and actually rotated it and investigated, look at our metaphysical, empirical commitments, we could actually become in contact with the tree and the knower, or at minimum, explicating your PTOK. This is an image my daughter, my 18-year-old daughter, who's a visual artist, painted for me as the tree and the knower. I think that's beautiful. And that we can take the tree and the knower, flip the coin, and actually make contact with the intersubjective and collective wisdom that we're all building together and contributing to. And it's an upload and a download, right? So we're contributing to the tree of life, and we're also downloading from it. And that we literally can then connect with the literal embodiment of our valuable place in the garden, that we are the earth peopling that's part of a larger solar system, part of a larger galaxy and superclusters and the entirety of this. And in many ways, we are, from a perspective of the tree of knowledge, we're not just small and insubstantial. It's actually quite amazing what we are. And to actually say within that and beyond that is the transcendent, which we could call God. So I'm almost done with this presentation. I'll just briefly mention, as part of a UTIK, we do make peace with the end of your life, that there is out externally a behavioral simplification of what we are. I stay agnostic to about whether there's lights on or lights off after that. There's the end of the era, the meta crisis is alive. So that's I don't have time to go into detail there now. And at the end of life on Earth, that eventually this will end, not today, hopefully, but that in a sense, metaphorically, life and existence wants to prevail. So I'm about out of time, but I would want to just take a brief interior example of what would multimodal mindfulness, mindful mindedness be like. And I don't have a lot of time to do it, but I'll give a truncated version. If one has done a variety of these practices and really made contact over and over, then in the moment, one can actually make contact. So somebody might need to mute. Basically, one can actually, if one is embedded in thought, you could actually kind of go back to a mindful posture of like re-embodying. And I may, for example, notice my face and head and neck, any tensions in my body. And actually, I can let that kind of relax and soften. And I'm kind of not necessarily trying to control thought or even give it much attention. I may do some type of portal practice, a spatial temporal practice or surrender where I can feel into this field of being that is not separate from me, that the me as a person is actually arising within that, and make contact with this. Could go into much more detail at a different time. And then within that field, feel the body again, feel my ego persona, give it some love. I've learned that not just getting to the ground and our experiential self, but actually giving some love and kindness to the ego and our persona allows us to then share it out in the world. And then actually recognizing and contemplating the enormity of us being a feature of existence. And so I might do a quick practice or recheck into that, and I'm ready to go. Then I'm ready to go live an amazing day and an amazing moment. and try to look at where I can bring more good, truth, and beauty into the world, right? Because now everything is sacred. If I've really rooted into what I am and what we all are, this is the beauty of this is not a us them thing. This is something we all are. It's more of, can we come in contact with it? So we all live from an implicit P-talk. The goal might be to make that explicit and refine our unified theory of the tree and the knower, or whatever would work for you and your own metaphysical, experiential, empirical framework. Connect it with UTOK, a larger metaphysical, empirical framework. And then ideally, we can come in as examined metamodern, metacultural metaphor of forest of persons, and invest short and long term in the amazing ecology of existence we find ourselves in and expressions of. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, friend. You linearly took us through an intense amount of information, but it was rich and clear and inspiring. I think we should probably jump to the next one so that people have time. But hold your questions. We'll hope to have some conversation. And then did we say Bruce was up next? Okay, so let's transfer and try to keep your mute. We'll keep the mute on. Everyone was muted, but we'll try to manage that and cope with it and be mindful. All right, Bruce, go ahead.
That was wonderful, Baron. And as we suspected in our meeting before doing this, that there's probably going to be a lot of consonance between the approaches that we have gravitated to and want to share. So I'm really hopeful that there can be some of that synergistic exchange after our presentations. Because we have short little windows, I've decided I like to do extemporaneous talking, but I'm going to read something first to get as much packed into a little bit of time as possible, and then hopefully enjoy the freer form of talking after that. So let's see, 1 second here. All right, so well, anyway, I'm happy to be here with all of you today, and going to be talking about the time-space knowledge vision, or TSK, and explore some of its potential resonances with and contributions to the UTOK project, maybe how it might be taken up by somebody who is interested in UTOK and played with to explore some dimensions of what UTOK is up to. And TSK is a body of work that's developed by Tartong Tulku, a Tibetan Lama who's been teaching in the West since the late 1960s. He's one of the last fully trained lamas from pre-conquest Tibet. So he's kind of a treasure house in terms of the way he received his formation, but at the same time, he's very knowledgeable about science and contemporary philosophy. And so while TSK is rooted in the wisdom traditions of Tibet, it's not bound by any particular religious or metaphysical system. Instead, I think we could better see it as a naturalistic approach to exploring some of the fundamental dimensions of reality, particularly time, space, and knowledge, but also some other things that it gets into, and mostly through direct experience and embodied inquiry, but also through careful philosophical and analytical thought. At its core, TSK is an invitation to radically re-examine our habitual ways of knowing and being, and to discover a more open, intimate, and liberating relationship with the mystery of reality. I think you could say in some ways it's a coin rotating and flipping practice and vision. It's not a religious system, nor is it a metaphysics in the classic sense of presenting a big model of reality, trying to, fully model reality, but it is metaphysical in that it has an ontological dimension, which invites us to investigate the fundamental nature of reality as it presents itself in and through the structures of time, space, and knowledge. And it asks us to question our assumptions about the basic categories of existence and to discover a more fluid, dynamic, and participatory understanding of being. And it also has a strong epistemological component. as it involves a sustained inquiry into the processes and possibilities of knowing. It challenges our habitual ways of constructing and validating knowledge and points to a more intimate, non-dual mode of knowing that transcends the subject-object dichotomy. Through its exercises and experiments, TSK invites us to explore the different levels and dimensions of knowledge, from the conceptual to the intuitive to, you could say, sacramental, deeply experiential, and non-dual. And moreover, TSK has a significant phenomenological aspect, as it emphasizes the importance of direct first-person exploration of the lived territory of experience. Many of its exercises are designed to disrupt our conventional patterns of perception and cognition and to open up new possibilities for encountering the world in a more immediate, embodied way. TSK uses language and imagery not just to convey ideas, but to evoke new modes of experiencing and understanding. And so that's one thing I want to say here is I'm doing an about TSK here, and a lot of it is really, it actually takes immersing in the exercises and immersing in the readings, which use some poetic and unusual turns of phrase to, as I said, kind of disrupt perception and thinking and actually put you directly into a kind of engagement with your being and your phenomenology and your deep assumptions. So finally, while TSK does not explicitly promote a particular set of values or ethical principles, it does carry an implicit axiological orientation. The fundamental premise of TSK is that by deepening our understanding and experience of time, space, and knowledge as constitutive of the fabric of our experience of self and world, and by healing the splits between subject and object or the fragmentation between body and mind, self and world, we can unlock greater possibilities for personal and collective flourishing. In this sense, TSK is ultimately a transformative, liberating practice, one that seeks not just to understand reality, but to help us live more wisely, compassionately, and creatively within it. And so I think that's, again, a nice point to emphasize here for what it's up to. It's less about presenting a big coherent picture of reality and more about asking you to kind of turn that on the side and figure out how are you interfacing with that moment to moment, and in whatever picture you're holding, what does that say about your deep assumptions of self and world, and how you can, it uses the language of thaw, how you can begin to thaw those structures and open up new possibilities. So there's some resonances between TSK and UTOK. So I believe TSK can offer some fruitful ways to explore and engage for any of us who are interested in UTOK and part of the UTOK community. So like UTOK, TSK seeks an integrative understanding of knowledge that bridges the domain of science and spirituality, theory and practice. And it offers a rich palette of experiential practices and poetic insights that can complement and enrich UTOK's theoretical framework. And just briefly, I can say that when Tartong Tulku first started in the West, he was in Berkeley, and he attracted the attention of philosophers and scientists and quantum physicists and other people from Berkeley who would come meet with him and talk to him. So he got quickly exposed to Western ways of thinking, and both seeing the value and seeing also the things that people were struggling with. And so that was part of the inspiration of articulating TSK, was a path of inquiry that could be consonant with the scientific naturalistic worldview that did not require all of the metaphysical and religious buy-in to a particular living, religious tradition like Buddhism, but nevertheless afforded really deep transformative ways of opening up our self-construction and our world construction and our modes of participation, the same way that a tantric practice or a deep meditative practice would do. And so he really wanted TSK to serve as a kind of bridge between science and humanities and religion. And also, I could say one thing he noticed is in the West, already Buddhist practice and contemplative practice in general is organized around addressing subject-object duality and splits and these kinds of fragmentation, and trying to address those things and open up fuller, more transjective, more embodied, more participatory modes of being. That's already an aim, and it's already working with issues that are in the cultures in the East. But he found in the West that the subject-object split and dichotomy and the kind of fragmenting of the worldview was even more entrenched and more systematically reinforced than he encountered in the East. So it actually was a little bit harder in some sense to work with Westerners around some of these practices. And that's why he began to experiment with different modes and things to do. So at the same time, UTOK's rigorous transdisciplinary approach to knowledge can provide a valuable conceptual context for the transformative inquiries of TSK. And by bringing these two traditions into dialogue, we have an opportunity for mutual enrichment, with TSK providing a whole set of embodied practices and UTOK offering real conceptual clarity, precision, and big picture thinking that's consonant with the present, scientific understanding. The ultimate aim of TSK is not to change our thinking about reality, knowledge, and experience, but to change our relationship to these dimensions in a way that's liberating and enlivening. And through its exercises and explorations, TSK seeks to awaken us to the fluid, dynamic, participatory nature of being, knowing, and experiencing, and in doing so, to free us from the limiting, divisive, and often oppressive structures of our habitual ways of understanding and engaging with the world. TSK is a fairly complex, subtle, and sophisticated body of teachings and exercises, and I can't review all of that in this short time. So in the context of this conference and exploring the insights of the unified theory of knowledge, I thought it would be good to focus here on the knowledge part of TSK. That is, how often do we deeply connect to our experience of knowledge and question what knowledge is for us? And just for yourselves, what's your default understanding of knowledge? What is it? What's happening when we know something, right? And how do you, in everyday practice and everyday living, how do you relate to what knowledge is? So what does TSK have to say about that? At the heart of the TSK approach, especially on this knowledge part, is a critique of what it calls first level or technological knowledge. And this is not only knowledge about building machines and that sort of thing. It means it in a more fundamental way. And this is the kind of knowledge that dominates modern society. It's a knowledge based on representation, on dualism, and on instrumentality. And in this mode of knowing, the world is split into separate subjects and objects, knowers and knowns. And then knowledge is seen as an accumulation of mental content or a mapping of an external reality by an internal mind. And then the primary purpose of knowledge is control and manipulation, a means of achieving our ends in a world of scarce resources and competing interests. And while all of that's powerful in its own domain, and it's actually allowed for transformation of the world in many ways, this way of knowing also perpetuates deep forms of existential confusion, dissatisfaction, and alienation. Of course, UTOK is in part about addressing this kind of gap. And so we can see its limits in the reductionism of modern science or the consumerism of capitalist society and the ethical and ecological crises of our time. So in response, TSK invites us to a kind of epistemic therapy. It doesn't use that phrase, but I'm using it for what it does. It's a kind of epistemic therapy, a path of experiential inquiry that recognizes and relaxes the limitations of our habitual knowing. And through multiple practices of questioning and opening up our assumptions around knowing and around time and space, and moving into different modes of being, discovering more open, non-dual modes of awareness and attention, we can begin to shift from knowledge of content to a knowledge of participation, a knowledge of presence. And so this shift involves a fundamental overcoming of the subject-object and mind-body splits that structure conventional knowing. And TSK offers a range of exercises for exploring this dynamic interplay of observer and observed, and recognizing knowing, at least in part of its transitional phase, as more as a unified field than an interaction between separate domains. One such exercise is called subject-object reversal. And so I want to ask you just in like 30 seconds or a minute here, just to do this practice really quick. Just choose an object in your room, just look around, find an object in your room and watch it. Just pay attention to that object. And then notice where you are in relationship to that object. Feel yourself as observer here, object there, and see if you can kind of unhook that sense of being here, and then flip it. Practice flipping, putting you as knower over in the object, and let yourself be the seen. So try to experience the seeing coming from the object and you being the object. So this object becomes subject, you become object. Let yourself be seen by that object. So this practice invites us to experience objects as subjects and to begin to collapse the dualistic divide between knower and known. And it does that actually by, it doesn't directly do it, but it has what I would call, it invites a kind of strategic estrangement where when we have a habitual way of relating to things, and it asks you to do something opposite from that and to distance yourself from the habitual mode that you're in. And in that, you loosen up that structure and you begin to open room around other possibilities. So through these and other practices, TSK cultivates ultimately with extended practice a taste of non-dual embodied knowing, a knowing that's not separate from the known, but that intimately participates in the unfolding of being and of presence. There's one little poetic piece that I wanted to bring in here before finishing. There's a kind of resonance. TSK, one of the TSK books involves a kind of geometry of a 0 point and a cone that unfolds from the 0 point into a circle at the top made out of 16 points. And the 16 points represent the fullness of the unfolding or the flowering. And it doesn't mean anything final. It just means that movement towards the fullness of unfolding. And so it has a geometry of cones that it works with. And these are cones of knowledge, cones of being, and there are different experiential practices for exploring those cones. And so, of course, we have the tree of knowledge, which is these unfolding cones over deep time and deep history. And TSK has practices for envisioning this whole deep time emergence. And it has practices for, you could say, at the micro level, micro scale of unfolding, seeing how from the 0 point, cones of knowing, cones of experience and expression unfold and move towards a fullness. And that's an ongoing kind of thing. And so it has a geometry that works with that you could say is in one way a kind of cross section of the overall tree of knowledge, showing that 0 point to fullness, 0 point to fullness, that makes up that whole journey. But TSK presents the cones in these mandalic flowers and these giant multidimensional structures that are unfolding in many, many directions at once. And it actually invites a kind of, again, challenging the way we normally see things. It invites a kind of 360-degree awareness rather than a linear point-to-point kind of awareness. And so in this brief introduction, I've only really scratched the surface of the richness and depth of the TSK vision, but I hope I've given you a little bit of a taste of it. It's a path of inquiry that challenges our habitual ways of knowing and invites us into a more intimate, sacred relationship with the mystery of being. And at the heart of this path is an experiential embodied dimension, a commitment to direct non-conceptual exploration of the lived territory of time, space, and knowledge. It's a path that uses poetic, evocative language to point beyond the limitations of discursive thought and to awaken to a more immediate participatory way of knowing. And it's a path with profound implications, not just for personal awakening, but for collective flourishing. By transforming our fundamental relationship to knowledge, TSK offers a vision of human possibility that is both deeply rooted and radically open, a vision of wisdom, compassion, and creative engagement with the world. And And in this spirit, I want to just close with an invitation to, for us to further dialogue and explore resonances between TSK and UTOK. I believe by bringing them together, these two profound ways of orienting and profound modes of inquiry, we can have an opportunity to really deepen and enrich our understanding of knowledge and to contribute to a more integral, transformative vision of human flourishing. So that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce. That was really informative and clear. I think we're seeing awareness of a frame, ways of living through that frame, flexible adjusting of the frame, transformative ways of adjusting that frame. I think that will continue as we transition from Bruce into Rob. Two wonderful presentations so far, but let's keep the momentum rolling. Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I share my screen, I wanted to speak into like both of what Baron and Bruce just shared have incredible practices in them, and I know John Vervaeke, as example, is really wants to build an ecology of practices, and I wonder how much TSK and some of the really neat stuff. So this is like another echoing to work on the practices that Baron was talking about, to actually investigate some of TSK because they're really special and they can really help you shift perspective in a way that's incredibly powerful, et cetera. So the merging of TSK and the merging of Baron's ideas with this stuff is super important and really exciting. Okay, so let me find my thing. Am I sharing useful over true? Are we seeing that? Awesome. Yeah. I like to start with this kind of slide because what I'm deeply interested in is having this be something that helps you personally. I'm less interested and think it's even closer to impossible to actually nail truth exactly in any way. Our access is partial. Sometimes even delusions are helpful, not suggesting that I'm advocating for delusions, but certain beliefs that may or may not be true can really ground us sometimes and give us a lot of help. So whether true might be a trigger word here, it might be useful over correct. And all this is really saying is it's my effort here to make this something that you walk away and you're better because of, less than this is for all time the most correct ideas ever. So if we start with the description that Greg wrote for this talk, right? Explore various approaches to shift one's identity to be both more grounded and in touch with the transcendent. A few of those words stick out for me. One is to shift, right? We're talking about a real change. Talking about identity, which I'm hoping that I can point to in a way that's a little bit more concrete for some of us, because that's a pretty hard thing. And I'm going to maybe say some different things about what identity is. But all of this is in the effort so that we can transcend something, okay? So if I have a little 20 minutes, I can't go as deeply into any of this stuff. All of us are sort of restricted by the brevity of our portions here. But what I'd like to talk about here is how to transcend the self. What does that mean? And to make the argument that if we can't grip what the self actually is, it won't be easy to transcend the self in any meaningful way. And so what might that transcendence look like? And again, in that useful over true kind of thing, I don't want to point to anything that you have to believe in or understand or even know. I want this to be first principles, something that you're capable of doing like right now. This is available to you in this moment. There's not a list of studying, while useful and amazing, it's also available as an experiential thing that's right here for all of us at any time. So please don't believe me. It's not about me saying facts that you're believing in. I want you to experience this for yourself if that's possible. So if we talk about transcending self, what is the deepest shortcut, the simplest way to do it? What is at the core of this thing? I think I have a pretty useful frame on that. And one of the things in our pre-talk that Bruce mentioned when Baron and Bruce and I were speaking about giving this talk, he said that TSK is slippery. And I like that. But let's apply that to the self, right? The self is slippery. It's hard to ground down into what it is and actually define it, right? It's kind of me. It might include my body. It might be my identity, but that might be slightly different. It could be this observer thing. What is this observer thing, right? The one that's watching all the things happen, maybe awareness itself in some way. And by the way, that observer is weird enough that it's confounding our greatest physicists of the day, right? Like, what is this observer thing? How's that, relate to quantum and all those different kinds of things? So Actually, what is the observer is a really important thing, and getting in touch with your act of observing is a really important thing. And I'm going to suggest, and this is if time allows, there's even this thing in a similar way to what Bruce was just doing with picking an object and looking at it. There's also a potential for an observer-free experience. I'll make that claim that we can actually sort of drop the personhood or even the centerness of experiencing in a way that's really profound. And as we do that, the deeper thing here is that it might change what we value and how we value as we begin stepping back into the identity of a self, et cetera. Okay, so for me, one of the most foundational places we can begin, and I've given talks on this in the past in the UTOK world, but it's to really oversimplify things and just say, there's two places that our attention can be. And what I mean by that is maybe there's two places that our consciousness can be, okay? And those two realms are thought and experience. And I'll try and pry those apart a little bit. And I don't want to go too fast past this because it's a deeply important concept, okay? So one is that we can have an experience, we can have the actual sensation, we can have the actual vision happening, and then we also can think about it. And in that thought, there's an act of modeling that's going on. We end up with potential options, and we end up with potential histories and understanding, and the birth of knowing begins to happen as well, okay? The deeper thing that I want to say about this is that it seems as though the self is the thing that is having both the experience and the thoughts, right? So if we were to ask, 100 people just walking around the world, it seems as though the self is the ground of which experience, the self is the thing doing the experiencing, and the self might also be the thing that's doing the thinking. Okay, so I'm going to argue that might be the default for most of us, but what if that's wrong? What if we have that a little backwards? Okay, and would it be meaningful if we were to realize that self in some meaningful way actually lives within this thought action that's happening? Okay, so what if self is a construct of thought? And also, what if experience itself is the core? And I'm just going to argue this again, can we look at it this way? Is experience actually first? Does it come first prior to thought in some way? And if that's true, I'm going to say that what we're discussing here, this is fundamental. We all start at experience, and then after experience in a meaningful way, we begin adding meaning onto what that experience was. Okay, so we start to catalog it, we start to name it, we start to know about it. And that act of knowing about things is the act of knowledge. And another thing that came up in my talk with Baron and Bruce prior to this is talking about enacting a metaphysics, okay? So if we're going to transcend the self in any meaningful way, one, why might we do that, right? Well, if the self is suffering, if we have a cry and a feel that there's more here, there's reasons to do that. But I'm also going to make another claim that the current metaphysics that's online is on default, it's sort of this ego position. It's this self position. It seems to be the most natural thing that we go into. And so if we're going to learn UTIK or UTOK or, use TSK in any way to change our metaphysics, most of us think that that's a changing of the self, right? Again, this is prioritizing that the self is the ground in some sense, okay? But I'm just going to argue that most of us, what's easy and on autopilot is I'm a self in a world, I'm an agent, I have a certain perspective, and goals and everything like that begin from there. And so I'm going to say that understanding the psychological self and what's happening here is deeply important. And so we're going to oversimplify that to try to get to some usefulness here, okay? So if there's two places that our attention can be, if we say, okay, that attention is maybe the first thing that's happening, what happens from there? Well, let's look at time, right? TSK is time, space and knowledge. Let's just start with time. Well, your past in a meaningful way is a function of you thinking about your past from right now, right? We can't actually go to the past in any meaningful way. The past is a function of your thought, whether it feels like that or not. So is the future, right? So your whole history and story of yourself and story of the world are functions of this thought process. So are other things, right? What your job is, your worries, all of these things, your hopes, your skills, everything about you. Okay. So all these things tend to arise up in thought. And I'm going to argue that this is kind of what the self is. right? This is the psychological self that's running in all of us. So if we look at that, here's where that self lives. It's up in thought. And what if we were to actually back up in some meaningful sense and actually observe that we are selving in some way? And so I talk about identity shifting as a thing that we can all learn to do, and a thing that could be very psychologically helpful for us. What does it mean to actually have the experience of watching yourself selving instead of identifying as that self? And if this is weird, that's hopefully why there's discussion time at the end, so we can get into questions about this and all that. But you could imagine sometimes this is when we become to be reflective about how we were yesterday. Gosh, I don't like how I acted. Gosh, I don't like whatever. That's backing up to a different level of self to look at a past self and kind of consider it. Maybe even in the moment, we can notice the impulse of a position. We can notice the impulse of a certain desire coming online. And this might be realizing, oh, I can experience the formation of myself and even the changing of myself as things happen to me. Okay. So again, I'm going to argue that thought and experience are different in that way. There's an immediacy to the experience. It's not in time. There's a nowness to it. There's things that are happening right now. And then we have this function of thinking about it. And one of the structures of thinking about it is with and through this self function, this agency. Okay. And another way to think about this is, just to argue it, is I would say you can't have thought without an experience, because your thought is an experience, right? That's what's going on. But something that's not as normal for most people is you can have experience without thought. And, we get into the neuroscience of that. Well, your neurons are still firing. Okay. This is where I'm not that worried about being correct. I'm saying, is this a useful concept? Can you have a direct experience of something without modeling about it and without adding judgments of valence of good and bad, et cetera? What is it to actually go into this? And this is really what looks like non-duality in some way, right? There's an arising experience that I can be directly in touch with that is not a knowing about. And I can also notice the experience of that drive to know about, that separation that happens between me and the thing. And then the 10,000 things begin, the world arises from there. Okay. So another way to say this might be something like, can we identify not as that self that's got its very narrow field of view of what's important to do and what we should know and where we should go and all that stuff? Can I actually learn to shift my identity itself back into the experiencer in some meaningful way? And what would that look like? So can I identify as experience instead of as a self? I would argue this is at the heart, or certainly the beginning, of the fundamental shift, right? This is a deeply meaningful growing of our psychology to have a capacity to do something like this, okay? So another way to say that is, when you are in experience directly, you're not in a self in the same way, okay? You are actually just tasting the strawberry. You're actually just feeling your feet on the floor. The selving is the model that revs up from that, like, what am I supposed to do? What are my goals? What's good and bad? Which direction should I go, et cetera. Okay. So this is something that you can actually practice, and the practice of it is simply the experience of it. It's not a path that in 10 years you'll get somewhere else. Okay. So if we take a second and we look at most people, what's true for most people, I would argue, is that they have very little connection to direct experience. It's not that they're not having experiences all the time, but they're mostly identified as a self. And so all of those experiences are happening in context to my goals and my legacy and how do I survive and how do people like me and what's most important, right? They live constantly in thought, literally lost in thought, never stopping thinking. And so in that regard, thought is not something that is capable to be used by your being. It is something that is using your being, right? It's like it's got you backwards. Like, it's just constant grinding. And if you invite anybody who's never tried to meditate to sit for 10 minutes and just go, hey, how much can you actually focus on your breath without thoughts occurring? Most people are terrible at that. They can get about 2.5 seconds before, why am I doing this? This doesn't feel good. I should do something else, right? All these thoughts start popping up. So beginning to stretch these apart to go, wait, there is experience and then there is thought, super interesting. Okay, super powerful. And it extends into healing our psychology, healing our relationships, 1,000 other places. Okay. So instead of the self being the thing that is having the experience and the thought, it's really more like this that I think is a valuable frame, right? You are an experiencing being of which thoughts are a subset. And in that, the self is a subset of your experience and of your being. It is a way of being. Yourself can be identified in a we space, like I am an American, so I'm going to go fight this war. I am a husband, so I'm in this marriage. I value that. I am a parent. I am a friend, or I'm just alone. Okay. All of those are your identity shifting around to model an interior and exterior, a subject and object of the consciousness that we're all swimming in. Okay. So I'll go further because I think this is a problem, thinking of the self as a concrete thing. It's not the self. It's actually a selving function, right? There is a contextual changing that will allow your identity to shift into a different selving function as needed. And the better you do that, the better self you are. The worse you do that, the more insane or dysfunctional or, non-agreeable you might be, et cetera. Okay. So literally you have many selving functions going on all the time and many that are at the ready to you in any one moment. Okay. And so the selving function can begin to shrink, and we can actually value other things and care about other things and experience other things like sunsets and your breath and tastes and sensations, et cetera. And we can actually go far enough into this that the self isn't online in any moment, right? Like it's literally not online in that moment. Doesn't mean it can't pop right back. You have the capacity for it, but it doesn't have to be so loud all the time. Trying to honor time. I did want to put in changing the self as an important thing. I think that's what we're all trying to do. Like by being here, we're trying to learn and grow and get better and understand things. Well, rather than remaining a self and trying to add parts to the self in some meaningful way, is it valuable to learn how to transcend the self? Because then we might have the ability to objectify the self, to actually change it in a way that we're not as identified with. Like if I am so identified with who I am and how I am and what I'm good at and how I can know, then everything I'm learning is on top of that lens structure, right? It's on top of that self-identification. If I can objectify not only a self or a part of self, but the selving function, all of a sudden I can make changes to that weren't available when I was identified as the self. Okay. And I'll say that if we can't transcend the self, it's going to be really hard to change the self in any meaningful way. So these may seem repetitive here, but if you think about changing the self, what is at the heart of that? We need to actually think different thoughts about ourselves. We need to actually get those thoughts to not be just fleeting thoughts, but actually new beliefs, new attachments, new associations about the self. Okay. So you have to change your thoughts. And if you do that, if you could change the thoughts, you can begin to change the beliefs about the meanings of all these things that happen to you. All right. So your hopes and your skills and what's possible for you and what happened to you and what that means can all be shifted. Okay. And by doing that, if you want to live just at the self level, that's what it takes to change yourself. That's the process of learning something new or going to therapy to figure out something about yourself, et cetera. The bigger game might be, and again, the fundamental first thing that we can begin to do to make knowledge and space and time and UTOK and all these things give a different meaning for us is to potentially transcend the self and have a different relationship with experience, right? We can actually go into experience and have a more grounded place there, okay? So identifying with experience as primary, again, I don't want you to believe in this. I don't want to talk you into this. I want you to start to have a play in yourself where you go, wait a second, is that more foundational? How much can I play with these interpretations and these meanings, et cetera? And all of a sudden we might find that there's a whole lot of freedom here. And I could make enormous claims about what I think this changes about humans and the world, et cetera. All right. One thing I want to make sure is there's no path. I know I said it before. You can do this in any and every moment. And if you were to leave it, if you were to self-identify for another 10 years, fantastic. You were just experiencing a self for 10 years. That's what happened. And anytime you want to come back and taste the strawberry or be in love with the grandness and the openness of your own attention and what you can do, you can shift it at any time. So you can do this attentional move. You can do this shift of identification in any moment, right? the self is the thing that feels like it needs the time to change. The self is the one that is living in time and has beliefs about what's true and what isn't and what things take. Okay. But if you can do this, it's a change in your relationship with the now, right? It is a literal embodied awakening to this moment, to presence, which is a different relationship with time. It also is a different relationship with space. It's a different relationship with knowledge. It's a different relationship with the lensing structure of myself. Okay. And I didn't cover lenses here, but I've talked about it in the past, what those are doing for our gripping functions, et cetera. Okay. And the thing I really want to say here is knowing about this is not the same as being it or doing it. Notice that our drive as a self is to see these facts, not actually see the self at all, and just add them to the stack of what the self knows and what the self has on its belt, et cetera. So it's really important to call out that knowing about this is not it, right? Being it or experiencing it is it. And then we can, within that self, we can see the knowledge that we have in a different way. It's a different relationship. Another quick thing that I wanted to say is that selving, the act of selving, that sort of default metaphysics that we're really good at falling into, that is what craves knowledge. That's what's trying to control and have and know. Okay. And I hope I've made that clear here. I have some other things. I think I'm out of time. If time allows, I could go a little further, but let's at least have a conversation first and then we could do things. But again, for this symposium, various approaches to shift one's identity to be grounded and transcendent. Transcendent to what? I'm going to suggest it's to this moment directly, and that can become deeply profound, deeply meaningful, really, really beautiful, et cetera. Okay. And the core of that is simply learning the difference, just at the very beginning, the difference between thinking and experiencing, and just to ground it home, two places our consciousness can be, thought and experience. And can we shrink thought as to an aspect of our experience rather than the primary driver of what we're identified with all the time? Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Lovely.
Yeah.
And I know you do back to breath as one of the ways to do that. When I was learning this, what came to me, and I've shared this a couple of times, is actually just close your eyes, open your eyes. And the flash of opening your eyes, certainly for me, I get presented with the sensory motor loop. And then I myself comes online and sees. But in that slice, I've taught myself, and the grounding of that moment has spread so that now my identity with experience is exponentially larger than my gripping self as a function of our context. And every time I close my eyes up, there's that contact, man. So
amazing. That's amazing. Yay. Good.
So what I would like is maybe if the three of you, because it's really fascinating, different aspectualized, but a lot of overlap. Maybe we could take an opportunity just to see if there are questions between the three of you. I'll invite folks to put questions, preferably in the Q&A, and I'll ask to raise hands and things like that. But let's get some opportunity for, and if there were points that you wanted to pick up on, ask about. How about the three of you have a little bit of a dialogue to see what you saw and what you wanted to pick up on, draw linkages between.
Great. Well, one thing I would just chime in. I love the talks. I think one of the things that I got out of this was that none of us are actually saying believe us, right? These are enacted practices that change experience. And for folks that perhaps feel that's a little woo-woo, we have to remind ourselves there are very naturalistic models, predictive processing, that our brains are actively enacting a world model with a self in it, and people can meditate or do sweat lodges or sleep deprivation or psychedelics and recognize when the model changes. And that's one way to frame it, and to be open to that's not the only way to frame it, because that's also a construct of thought, but it's a comfortable place for if people are not familiar. Second thing I would bring up is I'm a model maker and I can't help it, for better or worse. And so what Rob was talking about in terms of like, learning the selving function. So it's kind of an interesting, in my view, it's not saying that the self is an illusion, but it's a function. So just like I have a hand, but I'm not my hand. And if I walked around saying I was my hand, people would wonder about me. But we do all walk around saying, I'm Baron Short, or I grew up at this time. And that's partially true, but that's not deeply true. And that we can experientially understand that, not just intellectually. And so kind of getting back to an experiential self and basic experience, there usually is a little bit of a duality there of still an experiencer and an experience of the world. But as Rob is even saying, and I think Bruce is also commenting on about how you can switch subject object, that also is as well as a construction within experience. And there is this deep sense of, there's a lot of terms, theologically, philosophically, but this sense of being, isness, presence, awareness, you name it, don't get caught up on the word, as the ground of experience. And then within that, we could have an experience, and that's where I use that ontological tree, that there is this, within that still an embodied schema and an ego persona. And I personally didn't care about ego persona, except I could, for me personally, keep making contact and the schemas would come up, the presumably the relative realization of the schemas of the past projecting onto other people would still come up. And so then I was like, wow, I got to do some work at that level, if you will. But having the freedom to then do that work and even seeing ego and persona as a function of myself, not the entirety. And then for me, kind of which may apply to some of the TSK and also like what happens when we scientifically contemplate our nature and our place. This type of self that I'm flirting with, this kind of transjective self that actually is highly intellectual and engaging. But in my own view, if it's not grounded in this embodied experiential self and this basic sense of being or awareness, I think it can't grow. And that's what I've found. So I think of that being sense as a core feature to the growth of the rest of the tree, if you will. So being grounded is important for the flourishing. And I wonder about the TSK perhaps having some very interesting practices. That's where I've got to dive in more with, looking at the books, but also, with the community of like where that could be very useful practices at kind of shifting. So anyway, I'll just kind of some initial comments that came to mind, and feel free to bounce around.
Love that. Thank you for that. Bruce, do you have any thoughts?
I think you're muted, Bruce.
Yeah, I think you're muted, Bruce.
One thing, of course, is in part the journey that Rob described so beautifully is a journey that we've made already multiple times at different levels. At one point, we were totally immersed in identification with the body and as infants. And we couldn't differentiate clearly body and surrounding world. We couldn't control our bowel movements. And gradually, we're able to differentiate from it and control it. And it becomes object that's included, but it's not the entirety anymore. And similarly, we do that emotionally. As terrible twos, we're living deeply in the emotional self, and it doesn't really make sense to ask the baby to control their emotions because they can't take a perspective on their emotions. That is the world that they're immersed in at that time. And developmentally, we expect to be able not to dissociate from emotion, but be able to step outside emotion to see that it's something happening within a broader context, and it's not the whole determining picture. And so we're used to that developmentally, but for most of our culture, we kind of get to the thought level, but we never think about the identification that we're also having with thoughts. And so, some of these practices are ways to begin to also, facilitate or initiate that kind of transition. And any one of those differentiations can happen in a problematic way where we end up repressive of the body or we end up repressive of emotion. So they have to be navigated well, or if they're not done well, then you have to return to it and actually go through a reintegration and a deepening. But it's still no longer being subject to and lost in, lost in it in a way. And one of the phrases from TSK, it's not often repeated, but it appears in one book, is that the self is the shadow of a way of knowing.
Yes.
Right? And so the self is it shows up as a structure when you're holding. TSK doesn't use lenses. It says focal settings. When you have certain focal settings, there's the self is more likely to show up as an architecture of the part of experiencing. But there's other ways to play with that. Like the subject-object reversal, that's not an end in itself. It's just a kind of a loosening exercise to reveal how we're structuring. One poetic way that TSK invites you to just like experiment with how self shows up. It says it visualize a luminous desert, phosphorescent or bioluminescent flower in the desert. And you can see this very, very subtle glow around the petals. And it said, imagine that the self is the glow of objects. Experience basically your whole experiential field with people, with animals, with plants, with all kinds of objects. The self is a kind of subtle glow around the appearance of all of these things. And it basically just experiment with it. You have to see what it does to your sense of being and participation. Again, it's not saying arrive there as the way to be. It's experimenting with kind of the possibilities of the field of self-organization, and it opens up creative room for play and for new ways of being with people and with nature.
I love that. One of the things, so self as a way of knowing, I think, is a really subtle and important way to get at this experientially. And so let me try to describe something, right? I'm going to suggest that thought is the act of separating away from something, right? So the more that we're thinking about something, the more we're creating models about something in some way. And what I think is often invisible there is that the often unseen but almost necessary part of that thought is the self that's doing the thinking, right? The context of belief structure and knowing that is doing the thinking, okay? But the other side of thought being a separation from, in some sense, experience is emerging with. So the other side of that is if I'm thinking about something, I'm objectifying that thing to think about it out here in some way, know about it, name it, understand its qualities, et cetera, right? It's a moving away from. If I go back to experiencing it, it's a having inside, right? It becomes more subjective and inside of me in some way. So to what degree can we use objectification to understand ourselves, right? So if I'm asking you to embody something and actually see the self, right? That's you're moving the self structure, the selving structure. You're backing up from just a self knowing about things to actually objectify the self in some meaningful way. And to then actually experience what that feels like in a way is not to think about it anymore, but to actually like drop it and put it away in some meaningful way, right? So to think about the self is thinking again in a sense, right? And so that's a pointer to try to put the self into the structure of something you can objectify and consider, instead of just being a self and objectifying whether it's a theory or what happened yesterday or whatever, to think about it. But that difference between thought being almost a separation from and experience being a merging with, and that merging with, if it's in time, has to be a thought. And it's a way we can almost see, okay, I'm thinking again. Wait, I'm thinking again. Hold on. What's actually happening right now? What am I tasting? What am I feeling? What's going on in some way? And then thought can kind of arise within that in a more mature way. Hence the self can kind of arise within that in a mature way. Not sure that was as clear as I wanted it to be, but there's something neat there.
No, that's great. Well, Baron, if you want to reply to that, and then we'll maybe start opening it up for questions from the audience. We have
just one comment I wanted to put out there, given the audience maybe coming from different places. I want to be clear that the three of us are not advocating for what I call a spiritual bypassing, that you get into this place of experience and you're grounded, and then all problems have magically been solved and you can manifest everything you want in the universe. We're not actually proposing that. We're actually just trying to give the flexibility of, there's a great place for doing psychotherapy and really integrating ego and persona and work and getting into the experiential self. But we're also proposing a deeper, wider space that's possible, that could be part of psychotherapy too. The challenge may be, depending on the metaphysics you're dealing with the person you were working with, right? This may be too woo-woo. I've run into this where I can do work with people and they're very receptive, and other people, this is not a good place to go. So I bring that up just as a candid and practical feature, and that the idea that we're also not, at least I think I'm speaking for the three of us, that we're not proposing that we get rid of justifications. These are things that are incredibly powerful and have changed us from, into justifying apes that are now dealing with a meta crisis. So it's not a replacement for, it's more of a conscious clarity about justifications, the schemas of self, other, and world. The plasticity of changing that, the deep continuity with existence, right? That even, say, a TOK, it's still, there's a deep continuity and process and event that occurs from the now to the present moment, to a narrative time, to cosmological time. And so even my own tree ontology is trying to hit at these different cones of time and space from that perspective. But anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, thank you. So there are quite a few questions. Sigurd, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but this came in first to the Q&A. I can read it, or if you want to pop up, why don't I go ahead and read it? Certainly feel free to unmute.
Just unmute.
Go ahead. There you go.
So Nick Askew is a Brit living in the US who does a series of films he calls soul biographies. And what he does is he sits with one person with a camera focused on that person. And it can be in small groups, or it can be in a large auditorium with hundreds of people and sitting on stage and their image projected on large screens. And he uses simple prompts like there's nothing to do, nowhere to go. And people drop into a place without thought and express things that surprise themselves they didn't know could come from within them. So he is eliciting this thoughtless being state in a very simple way, which shows that that's a natural part of what it is to be human. And for me, what he's doing is I believe that our natural state, which we have gotten so far away from, is in that calm abiding. Mm-hmm. And if without the experience of that, it's hard to believe it's possible. So I think what these series of talks about is how can one get to that experience, so one then can say, oh, that's possible. So I might find ways to live in that mode of being more often. Thanks.
I'd love to comment on that. I agree with you, and it speaks to this kind of relational process where we can bring people into being. I just, as a personal note, the first time Rob and I met and talked together, he said, tell me about yourself. And I said, well, that's probably about the least important or interesting part, but let me do that because there's validity. And at one point he was talking about isness and being, and I just fell right in. And it's like, thanks, buddy. Like familiar with that space, but it's beautiful when you can do it together. And it was just like, thanks, buddy. That's great. So yes, I'm a big fan of these type of approaches for sure.
Why don't we go to Rick Rapetti, and then I'll pull another question off though.
Oh, thank you, Greg. Yeah, I really loved all three talks. Most people who know me probably know that I'm a champion of all the ideas that came up today. But I'm also a champion of things like UTOK. And TSK and all these other models, which are in the realm of conceptuality, right? And I remember this distinction when I was taking Gestalt psychotherapy training. where every now and then, the therapist would tell the client, we did a lot of practicum playing the roles of therapist and client. Oh, you're intellectualizing experience. Come back into your felt sense, right? But there's an important difference between intellectualizing your experience and having an intellectual experience. And we're all having wonderful intellectual experiences right now, and some non-intellectual ones in those moments where we were asked to not do that. So I just want to sort of praise both and remind people about that. Like all this wonderful information that we're sharing, it's all in the realm of conceptuality. But those maps are helping us to have flexibility and transcend and all that. So just kind of praising both, because often in this space, people think it's all about going in one direction only. There's a kind of anti-intellectualism, and I don't think any of you are guilty of that. But I just wanted to be a kind of in praise of agency, selfing, and all of that. If done the right way, is a great thing. And many of us need to be better selves, which is not eliminating the self. And there's a lot of these traditions that make it sound like just eliminating the self is the goal. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say. But thank you. Great stuff.
I think I have a quick one back for that. I think it's, a lot of spiritual traditions will find non-duality in a meaningful way. And then you'll notice that they vilify duality in some way, right? So, and it's a nested duality that a lot of people don't notice, where it's like non-duality is good and duality is bad. And it's like, wait a second, what'd you just do, right? So it's definitely a transcend and include crucial thing, right? It's like this selving function, how do we do that really, really well? And what are the structures of justification that we're sharing with each other? And what are the smartest things? I think that's a great point. Thank you for that.
So we have a question from Ken Baskin, and then maybe Ann Odell. Ken, do you want to unmute and ask?
Thanks, Greg. Are you gentlemen familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist?
Yeah.
All of you, I think, are talking about the movement from focusing on the left hemisphere of the brain, which is basically about building mental models and histories, to the right side, which is about experiencing life in the moment. And for me, what's key and what I hear you talking about is that you can't escape your model. We need our models. According to Terence Deacon, the last act of evolution of the human mind was that we experience the world symbolically. So we need to have a symbolic stance to move from. And the question is freedom. Am I captured by my mental models? And just a quick example, I grew up so angry. When I was scared or felt betrayed, I would find a reason to be angry at someone. And over the years, I've almost entirely stopped doing that. But that impulse is still there. I will be sitting on the couch at night and look at my wife and think, that bitch, how could she? And it's like, oh my God, where's that? So kudos. And I was just wondering if you had thought about the neurobiological implications.
I'll take a jab. So the one way I would frame it in the metaphor of left and right hemisphere is that, at least on my personal journey, is like having a lot of right hemisphere experiences and then not having any model to understand it, while at the same time finding it profoundly transformative. And over years, learning other models and then trying to borrow, upload, download. So it also ties to Rick's comment about you need both. So you need this embodied, relational, transformative experience that A, we become familiar with, we start to recognize, B, later we can start to bring on demand, and C, starts to actually become a habit, right? We've neurologically shifted into this habitual space. But then for us, it could just be for you or me or whoever has those transformative experiences, but to convey it and share it, we have to speak, right? We have to talk. And then we have to language it in a way. And so that for me has definitely been a journey of a lot of right brain, pretty quick change, left brain taking a lot of time to figure out how to talk about it.
Can I say something too? I'm going to argue that the frame of we have to have models, I just wonder how helpful that is, because we're doing the modeling thing pretty well. We're not doing the investigation of our models very well, and we're not doing the put down models and be in openness very well at all. And so there's a very, I would argue there's a place where you don't need models actually, and the models can arise as you're going along, and that they are almost in the patterns already for you in an interesting way. Not to set that up as a goal either. That is not a stance for modellessness. It is just an argument for, can we see our models instead of believe in our models as deeply as we do? And so then the models become useful when they're useful, and they become editable when it's time to edit them. And they are enacted constantly through our interactions and through our living. Yeah, so those are some thoughts back to that.
I agree, absolutely. We need models initially as we're growing up. But the question remains, are my models in charge of me, or am I in charge of my models?
Yeah.
Great. I think we have a question from Ann Odell.
Hi, this has been a fantastic discussion, and I've been so interested in UTOK and now UTIK for a long time. I attended the conference last year, and I've been part of the UTOK community for this whole time. And this is like such a fascinating discussion. And I love that we're ending on Ian McGilchrist and Rob, your slides in particular, which walk the talk you just said of, like, let's don't be all into our models too much. I mean, you had bold words on the page, and that's incredibly valuable for the depth that we're going to in all of this. And in particular, your words shift, identity, and transcendence. And literally, defining and inspecting each of those words. And the one that comes up for me that perhaps needs a little more discussion around and shared understanding is transcendence. Mm. So, if that's the goal, and, this whole notion of consilience between science and religion to transcend, right, to transcend our meta crisis and everything else, but what in actuality does transcendence mean? And I'm coming from a place where, and I put this in the chat, it's like experience can be associated with body, which can be associated, with earth, right? But we don't, we're not talking about leaving the earth, or in that old mindset of like leaving the earth behind and being totally about spirit and, exiting the earth. We want to embody, right, the earth and everything. That's what's been the problem. Hence our earth is destroyed. So for me, that's what's coming up, and the fact that even that matter is the Latin word for mother, which Alexander Bard brought up, yesterday. So to some degree, it can be like a male, female orientation. And anyway,
can I offer some thoughts back to that? So, transcend, I guess we could, it's funny because Baron and I have talked before, and we basically said like, hey, we're going to be wrong. This is back to the usefulness thing. We're going to be wrong about 50 times like in this conversation, because language is just a pointer and it's a model, and how something's received is not the same as how it's meant, et cetera. So the word transcend can mean lots of things. I could transcend a problem I'm having. I could transcend a way of being, maybe, right? Like it just depends on kind of how we're using it. The reason I use the highlight of that here is with shift and identity is specifically, what does it mean to transcend the self, right? What does it mean to transcend identification with a certain way of being, a certain gripping, a certain knowledge of what we know to be true? This is also why useful is over true, because our access to truth isn't absolute, right? We're interpreting truth, and clicking together meanings that we think are right in a really deep way. So we could talk about, can we transcend delusion? Can we transcend whatever? The solving function, if we can really see that and transcend that into a different level of being, that is a foundational transcendence that I think a lot of traditions talk about, a lot of people talk about. And I think that the act of understanding what that means, even for a moment, right? We then start to assign time back to it and go, well, if I've transcended it, I've transcended it forever. There's some permanent Buddha state I'll be in or whatever. And all of that is just more thought about it. More of that is just, did I get it? Do I have it? That's more the self trying to grab and grasp. There's an actual experience moment to moment, right? Of being able to put the self down that we all do all the time, but none of us see it and value it. Maybe not none of us. We don't see it and value it in the same way. And so the transcending that feels important to me and foundational and really, really fundamental for our current personal problems, for our current global problems, is can we transcend self in a meaningful way and make that more natural and understood and automatic as the next level of our conscious evolution? And I don't want to just trickle into this, but the three of us, again, when we were meeting, talked about maybe discussing the fifth joint point in a meaningful way. And, whether that's this digital thing or whatever, I'd like to suggest that a being that is naturally transcended self and can do selving really well and healthily is a different level of being for us that's really profound. And in our lineage, rather than having something jump off our evolutionary model of this tree and extend us into the next thing, that's what's like right here for us to have. And I think that'd be a very meaningful thing. And transcending self is I think what we might be talking about a lot of times, or certainly what I was trying to talk about as far as transcendence.
Can I chime in real quick on that? I 100% agree of like the kind of including and integrating the self, but transcending it into this, as you have even said, the selving function, and that there is that kind of ground, which I think provides, the term comes to mind, experiential plasticity and flexibility with models. And then I would also speak about a type of transcendence where something that started happening to me back in 2009, where it's like it's a flip role reversal, and you actually see this objective tree of knowledge within you. Like in this moment, I am a person influencing and being influenced, and have all these implicit schemas in my mind. But as a matter of experience, this person that I find myself to be is arising in a mind, a conscious mind that feels everywhere and nowhere, and nothing is happening simultaneously while whatever specific experiences are happening. And that mind is embodied, or it is emerging from or emerging through, depends on your metaphysics, emerging from or emerging through a collective biocognition of all these cells, this organism. And this organism is embodied from material of ancient stars, of heavier elements of supernovas, that itself is emerging out of an energy information field that is itself emanating from the transcendent, which is, from my view, would be transcendent from anything we know or experience. So that would be the transcendent. But this type of transjective self I'm talking about all of a sudden makes me literally, and makes you, and makes all of us like a focal feature of existence, a focal feature of this process, whatever term we want to use about the totality. And now all of a sudden, I actually care about everything and everyone, because in some weird way, we're all focal features of this ecology of existence. And now I actually care. Wait, I still have an ego, and I still care about how is this life going to go. But this life is not this being only. There's this deeper life running through us with a capital L. And now I care. I care about this fifth layer. I care about the inevitable collapse and emergence. And on a talk yesterday, we were talking about how do I play a personal role in reducing where I can to collapse and trying to help in the emergence, knowing that it's a much larger process than what's happening in this individual being. So transcendence of a self, the transcendent, like you could define an elephant sky god, and then this transcendence into a higher, perhaps a higher order type of self that's grounded in being, because otherwise it becomes too abstract and intellectual. That all of a sudden we care about the whole, like a true cosmic altruism of sorts. So a cosmic meaning a whole layer. So anyway.
And if you want to, is there anything you want to follow up with that, or?
Can we hear what Papia Ring has to say?
Yes, I was going to absolutely, Sooners. So let's go ahead.
Hi, it's a very complicated and artificial name. Call me Lisa. That's
okay.
Well, I have a question for Rob. I was very interested in the concept that if you transcend or do this transcending, that is kind of a dissolution of the patterns, if I got it right, and then you can maybe like tabula rasa. It's of course exaggerated. You can write a new self or a new patterns, right? But from a practical view, I think we can't really verify anything of that, because you have all these subconscious and genetic things going on. But what I find very practical is like you can like shift your identity to the free self, and you can shift it back to ego structures, so to speak. And this gives you some freedom to see I'm not the ego structures, and then maybe to create or to write new patterns is far easier. Of course, there are many other techniques to dissolve and develop and all kinds of things. But I just wanted to point that out because I find it a bit exaggerated to think of it like tabula rasa. Maybe you didn't mean it that way, but that's what I wanted to put in as a thought.
I'm not sure I know what tabula rasa is. What is that?
It's like a blank screen.
Clean slate.
Got it.
Yeah,
Got it.
That's it. Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, I love everything that you said. Yeah, I wasn't suggesting a clean slate of any kind. I totally, I mean, a lot of my work is about helping people shift patterns and see them differently. And some of that is easier to do than others. The reason I'm talking about this as the fundamental shift and moving like right to that as the first place to potentially play in a very grounded way is to see thought, let's say /self, rather than identify as thought /self. And it's a very long story what that affords you after that, potentially. That's the loosening function, maybe the very first starting point of a meaningful loosening function to disidentify with the self in any moment. But the self is a very capable shifting, like it's changing all the time. It's almost like meeting its context as best it can almost all the time, right? And so it's an automatic function that's happening, and in that it's unconscious to many of us. So to what degree can we bring that up to make it conscious that it's happening? And through making that conscious, we're not identified as it in the same way. We begin to back up from it. And what happens in experience is beyond just your feet on the floor and all these things are much bigger experiences potentially, like Baron was pointing to, maybe even an identification with oneness in a sense, where it doesn't have to become a rule or something for me to love other people. It becomes obvious to love other people because I'm a part of them and they're a part of me. And so learning how to be in experience and have that somehow seem separate than the self in a meaningful way affords us all kinds of other things. The other thing Baron was talking about was bringing the tree inside you, right? It's not a tree that I'm just looking at over here. It's actually like within me. A lot of traditions talk about getting to a causal level of consciousness. And that might sound to a self like, oh, I'll have more ability to cause things, et cetera. But it's actually usually reverse than that. It's actually, you have a realization that you're being caused, right? This separate entity is being pushed around by this dance of context and everything that I'm in. And so this inner and outer can dissolve in a really, really meaningful way. And yet I'm still in that dance, right? In that dance in a beautiful way. And I think one of the most important things for us to do personally is this work. But what that affords us as societies and as, global beings is a deep mutual respect, a deep internalizing of an usness, a deep understanding of suffering, a deep understanding of, getting out of just feeling separate, like objectifying myself away from the all and actually learning how to re-identify more with the all. And if the first part of that is just a part of the all, that's amazing. And that's way better than feeling fully separate. You can actually take that further and identify as the all in a meaningful way and start to have realizations that language starts to fail us here, but we start to go like, I am you in a meaningful way. And it's beautiful that you're separate because that affords the you that you get to be. And the Rob that feels separate gets to have that. But there's an identification with the underneath energy that is all of that is capable of play and feeling separate and doing all these different things. And so like a deep beauty can kind of wash over the whole thing. Back to those patterns, there's techniques and things to help people change those. And I think learning something new is one way that we could shake up a pattern. Trauma does it, lots of things.
Going to that, I know Yeah. So thank you for the answer. I agree totally. But I think also what you mentioned, like you first have to, I don't remember the exact words, you first have to see yourself as part of the whole. This is also, like a dynamic but you do that anyway, and probably everyone here as well. So it's not a first, but it's, you don't really know where it begins, but it's important that it begins. And I love everything you do here and the conference and
it's a leaving of time, actually. Meaningfully, it's a leaving of time. It's a represencing to this moment and to notice the thought structures of the past and the desires of the future and all that stuff, right? So,
and Jean Gebser wrote a lot about this as well, if you know him. Yeah,
I don't know.
Jean, really. He is one of the integral thinkers of the 20th century, and he was the first to formulate an integral theory. I think you have Jeremy Johnson on the conference as well.
We do. Yes, he'd be in the final
he is the expert on Gebser. So that's, and it's all about presence, right? So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to take one more question. If David Swedlow, you want to come on up, share your question. Then what we do is offer some final closing thoughts as we bring this lovely session to an end.
Yeah, thank you. So the question is in part inspired by this, the thought that can we view artificial intelligence and what's happening there as a collective form of subject-object reversal that includes kind of a toying with agency. So it's something that I believe you said, Rob, is the notion of that we can't have a thought without experience, but we can have experience without thought. And I think about AI in a way that it's sort of testing that boundary a little bit, right? It's really sort of questioning that. And in the way that it questions it, it deeply has us question it. Part of the thing that I recognize is like this question of collective intelligence and like experience can be a form of cognition. Thought is another form of cognition, but thought, we typically think thought is the only cognition, right? But experience as cognition, as this momentary experience, is something that's starting to awaken as we consider, oh, what is thought without cognition? Or is that possible, right? There's something in that. And so I'm really curious about this moment as we're blossoming into a hunger for this kind of remembering experience as cognition.
There's a lot there. That's really beautiful. I could talk a lot about the AI stuff. Let's just talk about if it's cognition, what if we switch that word to consciousness? Or what if we, like we're playing with meanings in a sense, right? So we could certainly put experience into cognition because the nervous system is at play, and there's all these reasons. It's again why I'm shooting for useful more than correct, because the correct is going to depend on the structure of the words and the meanings that we're using. Like math itself only works if 2 means 2 and plus means plus and 2 means 2 and 4 means 4, right? Like we need those structures for the rightness of things to be. So that's all I'm saying about, can we notice a difference between the act of thinking and modeling something and how that separates us out from the we space and the isness? And is there a more direct experiential thing that's different than that? And does that give us any ground to see ourselves solving, et cetera? The thing I want to quickly say about experience and AI potentially, I have no claims that everything isn't having an experience, right? That subjectivity may be the ground state entirely, and objectivity may be popping itself away from that in some meaningful state, right? So a photon may have some level of interior. If you've got an exterior, you may have an interior as well. What that interior is like to be becomes incredibly foreign to us very, very quickly, like even down into animals, et cetera. But if you're going to react to the physics of my environment, right, there may be some just basic level of interiority that is. And, Michael Levin talks about, cells with agency and all these things. And the experience that I didn't get a chance to do here is being able to switch our own agency around. And I'll just, rather than asking us to do it, I'll say it really fast. If you take maybe your non-dominant finger and put it on your thigh, you can switch what agency you're doing. You can actually identify as the finger doing the pushing. And then you can switch. Some people, it might be easier for some, but you could switch to be the leg that is being pushed upon, right? So I can literally identify as the finger as subject doing it, or as the leg as subject is being pushed on. And then there's a third position, which is like just connecting with the feeling, the experience of it directly without any agency. What's happening there? There's an arising of sensation without agency. And that level of agency or observer, like who's the observer, from which position am I observing this? In our regular lives, we're switching that observer space constantly. And on top of that, we have a narrative of a self that's doing that. And so to deconstruct that, we start to see, my identity is shifting all the time. My lens of care, what I'm making relevant in the moment is constantly shifting all the time. And so how do we begin to break that apart into really meaningful things? I hope that, good. Okay.
Lovely. So I'll go right to you, Bruce, and I'll invite you to each three of you to offer any kind of summary statements that you want. Bruce, maybe you could pick up on that and then offer a summary statement as we begin to close the session.
Wonderful. Yeah, I did want to say something very briefly about that. In a way, talking to AI, for me, I experience it as talking to a ghost. And I, don't mean that metaphysically in a real way, but it's an echo of something that is living. And you can interact with it in a meaningful way intersubjectively. I kind of think about how Jung advised some of his patients to relate to the unconscious. You can relate to the unconscious dialogically, but don't make the mistake of relating to the unconscious as a conscious caring agent that you're in engagement with, because it actually is a different kind of thing, and you can get yourself tangled up in some errors and possibly harm yourself if you mistake what you're dialoguing with. So I think that AI, we can engage with that way, but it's not the same kind of thing, right? That's my thought on that. Overall, I just really appreciated everything that was shared. I do feel that there's a lot of shared intentionality, insight, and possibility for fruitful collaboration. I noticed in some of the comments that this was maybe more of a male way of looking at things, and I honestly don't think so. I've been teaching psychology for 18 years, and mostly 80% women in my classes. And I think women have a lot to teach men about certain embodied ways of being and being in touch with feeling better than men often are. But when it comes to some of these things about our fundamental embedment in our conditioning and our ways of reacting and responding and how we're dividing up the world, I think all of us human beings are immersed in certain forms of identification that can be fruitfully explored, and they can be explored in multiple ways. I'm currently involved in practices that are doing this dialogically and dyadically rather than just individually with an individual practice. And that opens up new fields of possibility, but it's not implicit in relationship itself. There has to be a kind of intentionality to how you work with relationships. So, but I think it's a fruitful area to continue to explore. Yeah, love to have ongoing dialogue with individuals beyond this in whatever arenas we can. I want to thank everybody for what you brought here, both to my co-presenters and to everybody here. So thank you. It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. I'll point, just since it was brought up, we do have the sexual archetypes and gender paradigmatics if folks are thinking about men and women in the world. And so Baron and then Rob, you want to offer
Sure.
thoughts?
So yeah, from about the maleness, I would say I have maleness within me, but I don't identify only as a male, right? So I would hope there's a space for us to have maleness and femaleness within us and between us, and maybe have a predisposition, but not also be totally defined by that. We need to include and transcend. And some people might say I'm saying that because I have maleness within me, but hopefully we can move past that and include the conversation about it. I think as we, much like I shared a portion of my personal journey, it's like I had a lot of these experiences of the psyche that I didn't have a framework for. And I think it's important for us to go and look in the traditions and see what people have learned, because there's a lot there. And I also think it's really important as we're building this kind of meta-modern, meta-cultural framework that we both transcend and include. There's a place to preserve traditions, but there's a place to create new traditions, right? And so I would advocate that in that phase of dealing with the problem of the psyche and how to include the subjective vector, that you all heard at least 3 perspectives on some ways to go about that. And I would encourage us all to have lots of variation and selection as we kind of figure out this together, right? Like it's, again, none of us have all the answers or not, and so ideally we can co-evolve these kind of things together for the time we're in. And I appreciate what Bruce and Rob had to share. And these are your great friends, and it's been a super awesome time to be together. I appreciate and learned as much as I could from you. So thank you.
I'll jump in there. I'm so incredibly honored to be here. I love Greg and Greg's work so much. It's leading to friendships that, with Baron and Bruce, and there's so much incredible wisdom here, right? There's so much incredible wisdom in these models and in these pointers. The point of this talk that I thought I might bring, because what Baron's talking about with UTIK is so huge. What Bruce is pointing to with TSK is so huge. Each of them have incredible practices in them. And a lot of my work working with people, it's like, we're putting practice first. We're doing all this. The one thing that I really wanted to pull out of this is that there's an embodiment that's possible. And there's an experiential change. And so, if we're going to change anything, like I often use learning to drive, even the beginning of learning to drive, you may know how, but it's like you're still consciously trying to manage everything. Eventually, like that embodies itself, and you can be eating food and listening to music and just easily driving because it's now a part of you in some sense. And so as we're trying to learn any of these things, we need to learn them. Please, let's learn them. But also, like, what is it? What's the difference and the distinction between knowing about it and really embodying it? It's not enough to learn about morality and try to talk yourself into that if you end up falling back to being a selfish person who's hurting a ton of people, right? What is it to embody these things and bring them in? And to me, that the start of that is what I shared, which is just understanding this thought solving function that's happening versus this embodied really now experience. And I think you'll find that Eastern traditions and TSK and all these things are all pointing at, real presencing functions and real ways to play with the meaning that we're making in our psychology. And then, UTOK is giving that a real map and a real clear structure so that we can start to understand when we're feeling lost. So yeah, I really love that Greg mentioned back to breath. It's this simple practice of just knowing where your attention is and bring it back to breath. And that's a wonderful place to start. And adding knowledge onto that and embodying that is the goal. So I hope we all can just continue to do that well. And thank you for this time. Thank you, guys.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you so much. It is lunch now. Like I mentioned, there are actually some lunch sessions. You're welcome to pop in. They aren't, some normal. I'll be in a UTOK chat session. If anybody has any questions just to hang out. There'll be 2 others, one on the anagram, one on the gist of language. Feel free to pop in or just let your time get the cells and be and metabolize and then come back for the next session, which starts at 1 o'clock. So, all right, folks, thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone.
Take care. Thanks so much.